Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today, whether it's in person here at the Council, virtually on ACTV, or via the C-SPAN network today. Although Venezuela has only recently begun to again dominate headlines around the world, it has played a key strategic role in the Western Hemisphere and worldwide. And here at the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arch Latin America Center, we have long prioritized a transition in Venezuela. I'm Jason Marzak, Vice President and Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arch Latin America Center. Maduro and Chavez's regime cozied up to U.S. adversaries like Russia, China, Iran, Cuba for decades. Maduro propped up his dictatorship with technology, manpower, and weapons from these countries and financed his repressive regime with money from sanctioned economic activity with these countries as well. However, now that Maduro is gone and the U.S. is ramping up its presence in Venezuela, with the U.S. flag now flying over the U.S. Embassy in Caracas, long-standing power dynamics in Venezuela are being put to the test. Today, we will unpack how Venezuela's old alliances are changing or need to change in this new era and the resulting broader opportunities for the U.S. to counter malign influence in the Western Hemisphere, which is a key component of President Trump's national security strategy, which lays out expanding partnerships as one of the key goals in the Americas, alongside enlisting established friends. Today's event is part of our Venezuela Forward series, which is the Adrian Arch Latin America Center's steady stream of Venezuela-focused programming where we cut through uncertainty and also shed light on the country's future. And also stay tuned for more Venezuela content coming from the Atlantic Council in the next week, including our Digital Forensic Research Lab's upcoming report launch next Thursday, titled Watch the Watchers, Surveillance Technologies for Political Control in Post-Maduro Venezuela. I'd now like to invite the speakers for today's event to the stage. And as they come to the stage, I'd also like to acknowledge today the presence of Atlantic Council Executive Vice Chair and Adrian Arch Latin America Center founder, Adrian Arch, who's here in the audience today, somebody who cares deeply not only about the Americas overall, but about the future for Venezuela. As they're coming to the stage, we're also going to get you caught up on the latest from Venezuela. And I invite you all to watch this week's episode of our weekly Venezuela video series titled Venezuela Weekly, with installments every Thursday on Instagram, X, and YouTube.
This is Venezuela Weekly with key developments shaping the country's political and economic landscape. Let's start with a major shift inside Venezuela's military leadership. This week, Delcy Rodriguez replaced longtime Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino, ending more than a decade in the role and marking one of the most significant changes within the armed forces.
Padrino had been a central figure in sustaining the previous government's relationship with the military, so his removal signals a recalibration of that power structure. And who replaces him also matters. Rodriguez appointed Gustavo González López, a figure with deep ties to Venezuela's intelligence apparatus and close alignment with her inner circle. This points to a consolidation of control, with leadership relying on trusted actors as the government navigates both internal pressures and ongoing engagement with the United States.
Speaking of U.S. engagement, Washington continues to adjust its economic approach. The United States issued new licenses easing sanctions tied to PDVSA, allowing for broader activity in Venezuela's energy sector under specific conditions. This reinforces the shift we've been tracking, moving from maximum pressure toward a more managed reopening of Venezuela's oil industry while still maintaining leverage.
And that evolving relationship is also being reflected diplomatically. The U.S. flag was raised at the embassy in Caracas for the first time since 2019, marking a visible step toward restoring formal diplomatic presence on the ground. It's a symbolic moment, but also a practical one. A physical presence allows for closer monitoring of developments and more direct engagement as policies continue to evolve.
And finally, a moment that resonated far beyond politics. Venezuela defeated the United States 3-2 to win its first ever World Baseball Classic title, sparking celebrations across the country.
Watching that game showed that moments like this carry broader meaning. They can unify a country during a period of uncertainty and transition, offering a shared sense of identity at a time when Venezuela is undergoing significant change. Those are developments shaping Venezuela this week. Thank you for tuning in. We'll be back next week.
of Homeland Security. As well, Sam is a non-resident senior fellow at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security here at the Atlantic Council. Thank you so much for joining us today, Sam. Actually, Sam arrived with her suitcase on her way to New York, so thanks again for taking the time. Next to Sam is Nick Foster. Nick is a non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub. Among other things, Nick just recently published a great article on China's oil strategy in Venezuela. We are also being joined by two speakers who will be up shortly virtually. Ivan Kuish, who is a research fellow at the International Center for Defense and Security, joining us from Tallinn, Estonia. Ivan has published work on Russia's changing dynamics in Venezuela following January 3rd. And we will also be joined virtually by Sebastian Arcos. There, I see them both. Sebastian is the interim director of the Cuban Research Institute at Florida International University. Sebastian is joining us from Miami. I'll also acknowledge here that FIU is a formal partner of the Adrian Arsht Latin America Center. And Sebastian, we appreciate this long-standing and deep partnership with FIU. So thanks so much for joining us. Over the remainder of this hour, we're going to dive into these countries' presence in Venezuela, how that may be evolving, and what goalposts we need to look for to see how that influence is being diminished. For all of those watching on ACTV, on C-SPAN, or here in the room, you can submit questions using askac.org. You can do so through three different ways. One is text, another is audio, and if you feel so inclined, you can even submit a video question as well. We'll take all those questions throughout the conversation today. Nick, I'd like to start with you. One day before Maduro was brought to the United States on January 2nd, Nicolas Maduro met with Xi Jinping's special envoy to Latin America and Caribbean affairs, Xu Zhaoji. Given China's significant investments in Venezuela, and now especially, Nick, in the context of increasing U.S. involvement in the country, is China now starting to recalibrate its presence in Venezuela?
It's a great question. Thanks for having me here. Thanks for organizing this great event. I think before I answer the question, or to answer the question, maybe it makes sense to examine what China thought it would get out of the relationship investing so heavily in Venezuela, right? And I think there are about three phases here. There's the pre-Chavez phase, where it really was more dominated by commercial relationship, not too much a strategic engagement. But once Chavez came into power, China invested a lot of money in Venezuela. And it came up with essentially a way to invest, give loans in exchange for oil. And that really characterized the second phase of this relationship, where China invested massive amounts of money in Venezuela. It had access to the largest proven oil reserves in the world. It had also, as Chavez became more and more sanctioned, access to discounted oil, which made a lot of sense for China. And it had a good way to throttle this, because it had access to this regardless of the financial and economic situation of the country. China still had access to oil. So it made a lot of sense for China in that time frame. Now, over the years, the investment turned sour. The country itself was characterized still to this point, unfortunately, by economic mismanagement, endemic corruption. So the return on investment for China was really not that great. China got oil out of it, no question about it, to the tune just last year between 400 and 470,000 barrels a day. But the broader scope of the investment didn't really pay off. So as China now looks at this new situation, we can look back and say that over the last 10 years, actually, China has been recalibrating. Because in 2017, Venezuela did default. So there was a kind of a soul searching of the BRI model itself.
And I would assume that recalibration that's just been accelerated since January 3rd. How are you seeing that?
Absolutely. So right now, what we're seeing, so just to quickly wrap that up, the recalibration was really to the point that China is trying to de-risk globally, not just in Venezuela, but Venezuela being one of the riskiest investments that China did through the Belt and Road Initiative. Now it's come to a heel with the removal of Maduro. It's interesting to look at the reaction from Beijing, because China has kind of extended thoughts and prayers to the country. There's been really no material support.
Thoughts and prayers only go so far.
Exactly, right. So similarly to what's happening in other countries such as Iran, China is really not, doesn't have an alliance to speak of that it stands up for. So China has been in this process of recalibration, and now the priority for China really is to make sure that the remaining $10 to $15 billion of loans that are still outstanding can be recouped.
Thanks so much, Nick. I'm going to go to the screen for a moment and then come back to Sam here in the room. And Ivan, we'll go to you in Estonia. Russia and China have had similar responses to Maduro's removal. Strong rhetoric against U.S. actions, but really no concrete response beyond condemnations or, as Nick was mentioning, thoughts and prayers. Russia has previously positioned itself as one of Venezuela's most reliable strategic partners, but given their lack of response since January 3rd, how do you see Russia's strategic role in Venezuela now moving forward, and what does that presence look like?
Yes, certainly. It's a really great question, and thank you as well from my part for making me part of this very important conversation. I think the answer about what will be next, in a way, for Russia and Venezuela is that, sorry, a lot of the presence for Russia and Venezuela up to 2022 had a corporate and energy component, as well as defense and security. And what we have seen in recent years has been a transition towards less of a defense component due to Russia's involvement in its invasion of Ukraine and its own needs in defense procurement. And an increased involvement in the media and information manipulation sector. So I think what we are looking at right now is Russia attempting to maintain some sort of asset, some sort of influence, some sort of access, especially to the new government and the new configuration of elites in Venezuela, being fully aware that any new gestures that will increase its clout might be interpreted by Washington and by Caracas as attempting to spoil the new status quo post Maduro. So in that sense, Russia is treading a careful line between maintaining some sort of influence, especially in the security and media space, and not attempting to upset this balance that has emerged since January. In a way, the priority for Russia remains to have Venezuela for Venezuela to remain part of this symbolic reciprocity that it attempts to build with the United States, where what Russia perceives as infringements of the United States into its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, Russia then reciprocates by what the Kremlin imagines is influence in the United States, sphere of influence in the Caribbean.
Thank you so much.
Mirror.
So what I'm hearing from you, Ivan, is really just trying to maintain as much of it as it can the status quo of what Russia had previously, as it seeks to kind of adapt to this new context in Venezuela. I'm going to come back to the room here with you, Sam. So let's focus on Iran and its Venezuela links, and how are you seeing, obviously, a lot of other things to talk about with regard to Iran right now?
The status quo is not an option for the Iranian regime today. That's a different panel.
That's a whole different conversation. And as you're wanting to know what's happening in Iran, you could turn on pretty much any TV network or radio, and you'll hear Atlantic Council experts talking about Iran right now, with Sam among those. How is increased U.S. presence, Sam, affecting Hezbollah and the Iranian regime's strategic presence, the Western Hemisphere overall, but especially given the broader war with Iran, how are you seeing that playing out with regard to Venezuela specifically?
Well, when we look at the history of Iranian involvement in Venezuela, I think we have to break it into two buckets, and you gave a nod to them. That is the actual Iranian government, and I'll talk about that, but then is its proxy infiltration. The Iranian regime, and even prior to the regime in 1979, the Iranian government has had a long history of working closely with Venezuela. Venezuela was one of the first countries to recognize the new regime in Iran after 1979, and particularly under Chavez, the Iranian-Venezuelan official relationship flourished. And it was mutually beneficial. The Iranian government got some call it a beachhead, someone call it a foundation, I call it a hub. The Iranian government got a hub in the Western Hemisphere to do a lot of things, to get access to oil for sure, to get access to gold for sure, and to get access to entities that it could use to finance illicit activities, and that's where we get to Hezbollah. Hezbollah has had historically both the intent and capability to engage in narcotic trafficking and criminal enterprises all around the world, and Venezuela is no exception. So Hezbollah has, over the course of its history, been accused of, and individuals have been indicted for, they're at large, smuggling cocaine from Colombia into Venezuela and then onto other destinations. And then you ask yourself, other than that, what was Venezuela getting out of it? What was the thought calculation by Chavez and Maduro in which they decided that they wanted to affiliate themselves so closely with not just Hezbollah, but with the Iranian government writ large? The Iranian government has both pledged and actually delivered a not insignificant amount of investment in Venezuela in a range of different projects. We have everything from housing to energy infrastructure. It certainly didn't follow through on all of those investments. There was a lot of big splashy, ribbon cutting ceremonies and the like, but it did invest a significant amount of money in Venezuela. And Venezuela also got just a very heavy dose of diplomatic recognition, state visits, agreements, and the like. So the relationship was mutually beneficial. Now, we see the Iranian regime, and I will note that the worldwide threat assessment that was released a few days ago did say that the regime is still intact. So we're going to still talk about the regime, despite what the president is saying. The intelligence community does assess the regime today is still intact. But whatever is left of the regime in Iran is still appetizing to the government in Venezuela. I have no doubt that the Iranian regime will want to maintain ties with Venezuela, whomever, whether it's Delcy Rodriguez or somebody else. I think Hezbollah will have a harder time doing what it used to do because there's been so much pressure on it. But I think it is an outstanding question, Jason, whether the new-ish government in Venezuela chooses to maintain such a warm and deep relationship with the Iranian regime. I'm not saying that they're going to pivot fully into, the arms of the United States and agree to all the democratic norms and the like that we're focused on, but I am not convinced that they will want to maintain the Chavez level of relations with both the Iranian government and then, of course, Hezbollah, IRGC, and the like.
And frankly, whether the U.S. will allow Delcy Rodriguez and the government to maintain that the presence both.
I think there'll be a quid pro quo, and we've already seen that play out in other areas with, oil sales and things like that. But I think there'll certainly be a quid pro quo. I think, we've seen various countries kicking out diplomats and military attachés from countries that are not, friendly with the United States. We could see more of that.
So thanks, Sam. We're gonna move a little bit south to you, Sebastian, in Miami. Cuba's relationship with Venezuela has historically been, especially during the Chavez and Maduro years, rather significant. How extensive is, if you can get help with the audience understand how extensive is Cuba's footprint in Venezuela, and also some of the steps that have been taken since January 3rd to diminish this footprint?
Thank you, Jason. Cuba's footprint in Venezuela has been vastly underestimated. In a panel we just had on Wednesday this week here at FIU, there were two Venezuelan experts who argue that tens of thousands of Cubans advisors were in Venezuela at any given year since the year the early 2000s. Maria Berlau, who had written a book called Cuba's Intervention in Venezuela, gives several Venezuelan and Cuban official sources, besides also Venezuelan opposition sources, indicating that as early as 2000, there were already 7,000 Cuban advisors in Venezuela, and by 2007, Hugo Chavez himself acknowledged that there were more than 20,000 Cubans in Venezuela. Several other collaborators of Chavez who defected indicate that there was a high mark of about 100,000 Cubans in Venezuela by 2013. These advisors not just included doctors or teachers. There was a wide range of intelligence, security, and military personnel embedded in Venezuela's military, the leadership security, migration, identity and census, telecommunications, jails, etc. For decades, the Cuban regime denied having any military presence in Venezuela, but as we all saw after the military operation by the United States on January 3rd, the Cubans were there and represented a significant number of the inner security circle of Maduro and probably other Venezuelan leaders. The Cuban presence in Venezuela has been extensive, pervasive, and instrumental for regime survival. And what we see is an unprecedented takeover of a very large, rich country like Venezuela by a much smaller, pure country like Cuba. Now, since January 3rd, Cuba announced that it was withdrawing the personnel. We don't know, and I have asked several people, including the guests we had this week, how many Cubans are left. Independent reports indicate that Cubans are effectively leaving Venezuela and arriving in Cuba, but at the same time, they also report that Cuban military personnel is moving from Cuba to Venezuela still. So we don't know how many are left. And very probably, and I think the selection of General Gustavo Gonzalez, former president, chair of SEBIN, and who is very, very close to the Cuban security intelligence personnel as the new Minister of Defense, indicate that Cubans are still there and are still active advising the Venezuelan government.
Thank you, Sebastian. So I think one of the things you mentioned, Cuba and Venezuela, extensive, pervasive, and essential are the three descriptors of what that presence has historically looked like. But I think, as you're also saying, since January 3rd, a lack of clarity on what is actually happening with regard to Cuba's presence in Venezuela. Of course, a priority for the U.S. to make sure that that presence is not only significantly just diminished, but I would say eliminated in Venezuela. We'll get back to you on video, but I wanted to come back to you here, Sam. So cooperation, and then we'll go to you, Ivan, as well, but cooperation between Iran and Venezuela, Venezuela and Russia. It also helps, on the topic of oil, helps to expand shadow tanker fleets and shipping practices designed to move sanctioned oil, which has been absolutely essential historically for Venezuela to evade U.S. sanctions. How has this dynamic changed since Maduro's removal, and how will it continue to evolve? This dynamic of these shadow tanker fleets that operate obviously with a focus on Venezuela, but these are global networks, and Venezuela is one node in this broader global ecosystem.
Well, we have, of course, Maduro now being in the United States. We also have a decision by the Trump administration to actually pursue these vessels in a way that is different than previous administrations. And interestingly, when there was one of the issues of a sanctioned supposedly Venezuelan tanker heading out to sea, the UK government actually cooperated with apprehending it. It's kind of, remarkable to think in 2026 that you had ships kind of racing each other to try to get away, a race at sea because of these illicit proceeds. Now, of course, though, I do think it's going to be interesting because the US government, the Trump administration, does seem to have worked out a relationship with Delcy Rodriguez that could obviate the need for some of the shadow tankers, not only because there's now an armada of ships that are blocking tankers from getting out, but it does look like Venezuelan oil that is out of ground is being allowed to be traded, I believe, by the United States, you can correct me if I'm wrong, and being deposited into, a bank account. So as a sanctions nerd and as a treasury nerd, I'm quite curious to see what this actually does to the illicit shadow fleet of tankers. That's a big problem for Iran and Russia, of course, in other capacities. But right now, I do think that might be less of a problem in the near term for Venezuela. And I do think that Iran, of course, was a big part of that illicit oil trade. And Iran's not trading a lot of oil right now. So the Straits, I don't think the Straits have reopened while we've been having this panel, but I don't think a lot of tankers are getting out of Iran right now. And Iran did send Iranian flagged vessels to Venezuela in the past, but obviously that's on hold for other reasons.
Ivan, the shadow tanker fleet has also been incredibly important and beneficial for Russia. How are these new dynamics in Venezuela changing that paradigm, and what are the broader implications for Russia with regard to its shadow fleets?
Here I can only add to Sam's answer concerning the overall picture of the movement of oil out of Venezuela. I think I see an interesting parallel between the situation we have in Europe concerning the Russian shadow fleet and the detention of those vessels, for instance, as it happened in France recently or in Estonia some time ago. My concern would be the potential for militarization of some of this trade. There were reports some time ago of Russian military vessels escorting the shadow fleet vessels with the cargo either in Europe but also potentially in the Caribbean area. So I believe that with the evolving situation regarding sanctions and especially the Strait of Hormuz trade, this remains to be seen. But I believe this is something that Russia is looking very seriously as a way to deter future detentions and arrests of these vessels. But it's something that is yet to be fully determined.
Thanks, Ivan. Nick, I want to go back, staying on the topic of oil. And you were speaking previously about how much Venezuela still owes to China and the loans to China. Most of those have been paid off, 10 to 15 billion. It's a lot of money. 60 billion, and there's a lot of money that's still owed to China that Chinese President Xi is reluctant to speak about insofar as what he still has in it from Venezuela, and so much of China's investments have historically been collateralized by oil shipments. With these new dynamics in play, with Venezuela still owing China oil, is Beijing concerned not just about the oil it's still owed, but looking ahead to future energy access in Venezuela as well, which will remind everybody, a country with the world's largest petroleum reserves, and where there are Chinese firms that continue to operate within Venezuela?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a very dynamic environment right now. What I would say is the following, that this broader oil for loan program that China executed in Iran and in Venezuela, Angola, other places, that is probably not going to happen again. Now, there's two different dynamics here. For China itself, it received about 4% of its oil from Venezuela. So an important and discounted, but not really that meaningful slice of the general pot. Now, there are some interesting dynamics in China itself because these sanctioned oil tankers that mostly came through Malaysia landed in a province in China that had these refineries that were just set up for sanction evading tankers. So that will probably also end as well. So in China itself, we're probably going to see some more regional impacts of these oil flows being stopped. But for Venezuela, which exported about more than 50% of its oil to China, it's going to be really important to keep this oil flowing, right? They want to make sure that, this is a good client of theirs, so they want to keep selling that oil. And I would imagine for the US government, this is of interest as well, because they want to make sure that this government does not go completely bankrupt, right? So this is a chain that they want to keep open. Last thing I'll say here is that China has, over the last 5 years, basically since the pandemic, massively stocked up its strategic petroleum reserve. They bought low during the pandemic, and they're actually sitting on about 4 months of reserves right now. So they'll probably, even with the Strait of Hormuz that was just mentioned here, they're probably looking okay. But I imagine that in Beijing there are a lot of discussions going on right now, because between Iran, Venezuela, and Russia, that's about 40% of sanctioned oil that went to China. So they got pariah discount oil, and that is changing. So for China itself, this calculus is changing, and they're probably going to look at getting more oil from Russia, getting more oil over land routes. That's a broader strategy that they've been using to get away from these Strait of Hormuz contingencies or Venezuela type of interventions where suddenly the government is changed.
So Nick, not a large percentage of China's oil, but how concerned what's your reading of how concerned you think Beijing actually is about, within the broader scale, what's happening in Venezuela and how that could impact, because even that small sliver is important for the Chinese economy.
Correct. It is important, and again, with these regional, they call teapot refineries, it's a funny name, but for those type of regions, it's very important because that's where they get their oil from, right? In the broader scheme, not so much. I think there's other investments that China has made in the broader oil industry. Maybe we'll talk about this a little bit. China's made massive investments in the telecom industry as well, so they have other sectors that they have invested in. So they don't make sure that these investments keep paying and that they get paid for these, right? But broadly speaking, I think it's more that China is pivoting away from this discount pariah oil model that they've been living really well with for the last 10 years.
So for all those tracking what's happening on OFAC licenses since January 3rd, there's been a number of licenses to permit greater investment in Venezuela over the last couple of months. These are coming out at a pretty rapid pace, actually. I mean, what we're seeing, the scale of U.S. involvement, U.S. Frankly, partnership with Venezuela, from Secretary Wright going down a couple of weeks ago, Secretary Burgum down recently. There was a U.S. Senate staff delegation there this week as well. But all these licenses since January have expressly not applied to entities from the 4 countries we're talking about today, from Cuba, from Iran, from Russia, and from China. Question for the whole panel: is this having the intended effect? With these licenses are specifically not applying to these 4 countries, are we starting to see a further reduction in the presence or potential presence moving forward?
I think it's a little too soon to tell. Iran's obviously a different case based upon the fact that anyone that's a senior leader there is getting assassinated right now. But I do think that we are likely going to see additional sanctions lifted on Venezuelan energy products generally. The U.S. administration is certainly considering ways to try to ease not just oil prices, but gas prices. And there have been a range of options floated. They did release reserves from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. There are a lot of debates about whether the U.S. administration will move to limit exports of U.S. energy products. What they'll probably do prior to that is unsanction various energy commodities, like they've done it with Russian oil. Could they do more in the Venezuela space? I think so. And for Venezuela, in terms of whether it will, these licenses and elsewhere will ease its relationship with Iran, I really think that's going to depend on what the new Iranian regime looks like, and really whether the United States means what it says when it says it doesn't want regime change. So right now, honestly, and if we look at the arc of history, this is a microsecond, right? Since Maduro left power, Delcy Rodriguez is there. There seems to be a pragmatic working relationship, and the strategy does seem to be to leave the regime intact and hopefully try to move it into a more positive direction. It's too soon to tell whether the U.S. is actually committed to that, and too soon to tell whether Delcy Rodriguez is actually committed to that. The Iranian regime, we have no idea what is going to be left when the United States and Israel stop military operations. I think that in the next week or two, we could see additional countries, and this impacts Venezuela. I'm not digressing, I promise.
No, go for it.
We actually could see additional countries move to quote unquote reopen the Strait of Hormuz. We have another Marine expeditionary unit headed to the Middle East right now. So the course of what's happening vis-a-vis Iran is remarkable and evolving quickly, not to mention the fact that Israel has struck Iranian energy infrastructure. And of course, Iran hit Ras Laffan in Qatar, which is a natural gas facility, and it's going to be offline probably for 5 years. So I think it's too soon to tell what the Iranian-Venezuelan relationship is going to look like, particularly from an energy standpoint.
Other comments on the license, and I think on your point, Sam, as well. We're going to continue to. We've seen this more and more licenses being granted since January 3rd. In order to get this full investment into Venezuela, we're going to need to see more and more licenses being granted.
I'll just make one point on that very quickly, and I must apologize. I started my career in Iraq when we were trying to entice business people to come with, all these inducements and things like that. I think businesses are going to make decisions about doing business in Venezuela based on business considerations. So I do think that the administration is wisely, trying to open up the Venezuelan economy, but I don't know that anyone is jumping to dive in headfirst just yet.
Business considerations and also long-term business considerations, not just what we've seen over a few months. Any other comments on the OFAC licenses?
Yeah, I think Sam made an excellent point. It's really early to tell. From the Chinese perspective, the Chinese investment model has changed quite a bit. These large-scale investments still happen, but they're not happening right now in Latin America writ large. And they've been, I don't want to say they've been burned in Venezuela, but they are definitely de-risking from Venezuela writ large. So I don't think we're going to see a large-scale reinvestment, especially under the consideration that they can't even get the licenses.
Well, one thing that we've learned about Venezuela since historically, but also since January 3rd, is that Venezuela does not operate it's not an isolated case, right? This is why we're having this conversation because of Cuba, Russia, Iran, China, but also what happens in Venezuela has broader implications in the way it's viewed and the way that Delcy Rodriguez seeks to try to maintain her power in Venezuela and how other countries are looking at that. And I'm leading up to you, Sebastian. Because there's a lot of attention right now on Cuba as well. Sam's been talking about what's happening in Iran, but we're all following what is quickly moving forward in Cuba. How are the Cubans looking at the situation in Venezuela right now? What kind of parallels do you think that the regime in Havana is potentially drawing between the two different situations, if any parallels, although I would reckon to think that they are looking at Venezuela and trying to learn lessons for themselves?
We need to make a difference between, when we say Cubans, I like to refer to the Cuban people and the regime, the Cuban regime. They're looking at the Venezuelan model, to call it somehow, in different ways. The Cuban regime, I think, likes the model. It's interested, perhaps, in replicating the model because the regime remains in power, pretty much intact, with a more or less normal relationship with the United States. And that will allow this regime, or whoever is leading the regime at the end of this process of negotiation, will be allowed to survive for a number of years. Now, the Cuban population, both inside and outside the island, have a completely different perspective. Those Cubans don't like what they see in Venezuela. The regime is pretty much intact. The opposition is still out of power. Political prisoners continue in jail. There is no significant visible movement in a direction of liberalizing the society and going to free elections. Cubans don't like that model. And because Cuba and Venezuela are two completely different animals, I don't believe that it is possible to apply the Venezuelan model to Cuba. Venezuela is still an authoritarian regime, but you could see inside the regime and find individuals, spheres of power within the regime, and the United States was able to approach Delcy Rodriguez and negotiate this kind of transactional uh, model that we have now. Cuba is a totalitarian regime, has been for 67 years. It's a completely different style of regime. It's very opaque. It's very hierarchical. It's very difficult to look inside and identify individual players. There is only one structure of power and one control. It flows from the top down. Everybody has to abide by what comes down. Any attempt at negotiating with the United States behind that power is seriously punished. So we cannot identify someone in Cuba today that could become a Delcy Rodriguez. I believe that the regime still needs to be shocked by the United States, whether it's by this current crisis with fuel or perhaps by some sort of limited kinetic action in order to crack the leadership, and then perhaps we can see better who would be the alternative in Cuba. Currently, as it looking, Venezuela is not a good example for Cuba.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sebastian. Really important to distinguish between the Cuban regime, the Cuban people, what each want. The regime hopes to be able to maintain itself as Delcy Rodriguez has been able to continue, but obviously the wide differences between Cuba and between Venezuela, the history, and the fact that Venezuela was a well-functioning democracy back in the 1990s, and Cuba's been nearly 7 decades. I want to bring in some questions from askac.org, and again, if you have a question, please feel free to ask those as well. I'm going to go ahead and bring up this first question, anonymous, of whether will Russia, China, Iran, and Cuba, will they simply allow the U.S. to take over their hub of influence in the Western Hemisphere? I'm not sure if they have much of a choice, to be honest. But Sam, let me start
I'm going to make
there.
a very small point because these guys are quite expert in this. I think about it less in a black and white way today than I did, previously. I think that the U.S. thinks about influence in different ways in other countries, and for example, as I'm sure you're going to speak about, China has quietly gone about getting influence in the Western Hemisphere. The United States has gone about it by moving an armada down to Venezuela and shooting drug traffickers out of the sky. So I'm not trying to be glib, but I think we have to think about that gray area. It's not either or, and I think that the United States is trying to figure out, and this was detailed in the national security strategy, in fact, regional champions in the Western Hemisphere being the most important geography in the world. It's not either or, we're probably gonna see a mix.
Yeah, the question is really what's the long-term strategy here, right? So we've seen these moves, and you can debate if they were, history will tell. But at the end of the day, China is still the largest trading partner of South America. If the connections are deep, I've talked a little bit about telecom infrastructure. It's embedded into these systems, and so it's not that China is out of the region or the country itself, right? The relationship is changing, and China is looking at this and learning. They're learning along. A, should we put our eggs in this basket? Probably not. B, we've invested a lot in security systems. They didn't work, C, from a military perspective, all these defense systems, kind of the United States was just able to walk over them. So these countries like China, they're looking at this as a learning experience. Like, what can we do better next time? So that's another thing we should keep in mind.
Excellent points. I think also when we look at influence in the hemisphere, Nicaragua remains a significant point of influence for all 4 countries. as well as we do a lot of work here on U.S. economic security in the hemisphere, and especially building off of the national security strategy, which is how do we actually accelerate that commerce, that investment across the region. All my conversations are countries, they want more U.S. investment. They want more U.S. commerce. It just hasn't come previously. And now we have an administration that's focused on using the levers of the U.S. government to be able to facilitate that investment. Sebastian, I saw you nodding your head. Did you want to also, did you have a comment on that question as well?
No. I was just agreeing with the point being made at the time.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I want to bring up a question here that I also have for the panel, which I think is incredibly important as we have about 10 minutes left here. We've diagnosed a lot of where the relationships stand, where they stood prior to January 3rd. But I think what's really important is to put on the table specific steps that need to be taken, and verifying that Delcy Rodriguez's government is actually taking the steps necessary to reduce or eliminate some of the malign influence of actors. I think, you look broadly across the hemisphere, there are certain things that China invests in that's, a road from a small village to another small village. Okay, build the road, right? It's about that malign influence and technology and telecom, as you're speaking about, Nick. We've talked about ports in different parts of the hemisphere. We do a lot of work at the Adrian Arch Latin America Center on ports and port security as well. But I'm going to bring up this question here, which is, what kind of specific steps would the U.S. need to take to completely root out these influences from Venezuela? And then there's a second question here. Would they need to allow arms sales to also replace Russian machinery? There's a Russia-specific part of that question, so maybe, Ivan, I'll start with you.
Yes, certainly. I think when it comes to the influence, what steps can be taken, I think this is something that the United States will have to define when it comes to what type of red lines it will tolerate when it comes to Russian influence in Venezuela, and to define it together with the Venezuelans, of course, because otherwise Russia's presence, for instance, in the media and information space can be quite pervasive. We have seen journalist training activities. They've had RT and state-controlled media taking root. So it'll be a question about what narratives are malign, what narratives they define will cross the boundary into being malign, rather than to add to the conversation. When it comes to arms, I think Russia for the long term will be quite constrained when it comes to its defense procurement and its offer internationally, despite what the Kremlin might say about its arms transfers. Perhaps there's one space where Russia will remain competitive, and that is drone technology and everything associated, and electronic warfare as well. Here, I think it'll be a matter of what the fiscal situation will be in Venezuela for the foreseeable future, and what type of, again, red lines emerge in the U.S.-Venezuela relationship when it comes to this type of technology transfer.
Thanks. Nick, I want to go to you on this one too, because we've done some work, actually myself and a few of our fellows here co-author. We have a memo to the president series, and one of the things that we said needs to be done, especially in the short term, is need to root out the Chinese surveillance, and you have the deep Chinese telecommunications network, technology network that pervades across Venezuela. How can Delcy Rodriguez eliminate that influence, and what are those steps that could be necessary, especially because you look at drawing down more U.S. business into Venezuela? Well, business will be very apprehensive about the technology backbone being Chinese technologies, which is what you get in Venezuela right now.
Yeah, it's a really hard nut to crack. So two things on this. One is that China exports technology that enables authoritarianism. So they do that all over the world. And Venezuela is probably the best case for this in the Western Hemisphere. And we see that with multiple technologies like the Carnet de Patria and whatnot. It's not just telecommunications, right? It's a lot of services that are linked to this. Access to benefits, et cetera. So I think it's going to be really hard to uproot this system because it provides services to people. And quite frankly, whoever the next government, whatever the next government will look like in Venezuela, they're probably going to have an interest to keep using this system. It's going to be extremely expensive to take it out and replace it. And again, there's no private sector is going to get in there now for multiple reasons. But this system also provides a lot of benefit to the people and to the government itself, regardless if it's a Delcy Rodriguez government or whoever the next person is. So I think we have to keep that in mind, that it's not just the technology that is unsafe and able to be hacked. We've seen that in Iran with the cameras being multiple use and whatnot. But there's also this aspect of these services, these technologies being used as platforms to deliver services. So I think it's not so easy to just say, let's just rip it all out. A, it's cost prohibitive, and B, these systems actually provide services that the Venezuelan people probably appreciate.
We have about 5 minutes. I want to do a last kind of lightning round between the four speakers. And maybe I'll ping between the video and the in-studio speakers. We'll start with you, Sebastian. What should our viewers, or those in the audience as well, what should they be looking for in the next 4-6 months? Choose your time frame to see that the Cuban influence in your case, Sebastian, has really reduced or been significantly, or frankly even eliminated in Venezuela. What are some of those key indicators you've talked about? We've seen also the reporting of who's coming back and forth, but also the Cuban military or security services, Cuban doctors. What should we be looking for from the Delcy Rodriguez government to show that her perspective is that the future of Venezuela is not one that is so tied to Cuba?
Mm-hmm. Well, the Cuban presence in Venezuela is so entrenched that it's going to be difficult to count them one by one, whether they leave or not. I think we need to engage much more with the Venezuelan opposition and the media, the independent media in Venezuela. They are the ones who can tell us exactly how many Cubans are left, how many are gone back, how many are still working as doctors or not, how many are working as security. I think the most important indicator that we get from the Venezuelan government is how fast are they moving away from the previous model and into an open society model and democratic accountability. The faster they move, I think, will be a clear indicator that the Cuban influence is waning. What they are showing so far as moving so slowly seems to indicate that the Cuban influence is still strong and is still there.
Thanks, Sebastian. Nick, let me go to you then on this question with regard to China, and then I'll go to Ivan and end with you, Sam.
Yeah, I think a few things that we can look for in the near term at least is the continued delivery of oil, just to see if these relationships remain, if oil still keeps flowing to China. I think in the medium to long term, we want to make a shameless plug here for Aid Data, great folks at William and Mary. They look at this in great detail, and they look at essentially the loan portfolios. How have they changed over these years? Is China still getting money out of Venezuela? Are they extending any new loans? I think that will show how the relationship changes. And then lastly, obviously, to the point earlier made, how much is this administration willing to have China part of the solution to Venezuela? Are they out of the system? Are they out of the picture? Or is this an extenuating circumstance? That'll be really interesting to watch.
Yeah, and maybe we'll get some more indications when President Trump and President Xi eventually have their meeting as well. Ivan, how do you see this?
Yes, certainly. I think I would only point to two things as indicators that I would like to see as revealing of the direction of the relationship between Russia and Venezuela is precisely the communications. Are there statements where they declare each other to be partners? Do they, in multilateral fora, in bilateral fora, do they echo each other's rhetoric about multipolarity, about all the strategic narratives that Russia is and the Kremlin is promoting worldwide? Just in March, we saw some statements along those lines by the Venezuelan foreign ministry. So this is something I would like to see about the narratives and the information they disseminate. That's for one point. for the longer term, I think, just to add a bit to what Sebastian was saying about Russian presence, I think what I would find to be very important would be that that Caracas would open up a bit more about the nature of its intelligence and security cooperation with Russia. Maybe open some of the archives, reveal some of the business dealings that went behind that. And I think that to shed a light on that would go a long way into creating some sort of trust when it comes to its relationship with Russia.
Thank you so much. And I think also before I go to Sam here, when Delcy Rodriguez took over her current position, the first people that she greeted were the ambassadors from Russia, from China, from Iran. And so the question would be, if you were still going to have that ceremony today, would those be the first people that she would be greeting? And I think it's an excellent point, Yvonne, on that alignment of statements at international fora, because that is what we've historically seen with Russia. Well, Sam?
I'm going to give you two very tactical ones, which is unlike me. First is, I'm very curious to see how the information ecosystem in Venezuela does or doesn't shift. And what I mean by that is, within Venezuela, there's been a whole lot of Iranian propaganda going through state-owned media channels and otherwise, so I'm curious to see if that shifts. And also whether the Delcy Rodriguez government at any point openly or quietly kicks out IRGC operatives, Quds Force, and or Hezbollah networks that are resident in country. They could do so quietly, or if they really want to curry favor with the Trump administration, they could do so quite publicly. But that is something specific that could happen. You could see extraditions to the United States and otherwise if we have that legal framework with the Venezuelans. I don't know if we do, but those are two tactical ones.
Yeah, and to be able to root out some of those groups, it'll also be important, the support of the Colombian military and Colombian intelligence as well. I want to end by thanking our four speakers. Thank you, Sebastian. Yvonne, thank you so much for staying up late in Estonia on a Friday evening for joining us. Really appreciate that. Thank you so much, Nick, and thank you so much, Sam, and also thank you to my colleague, Ilona Barrero, who did excellent work putting together today's event. I want to hold your applause for one moment because I want you to mark your calendars again. Thursday, March 26th at 10 a.m., the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensics Research Lab, as I mentioned, will virtually launch its latest findings and report titled Watch the Watchers, Surveillance Technologies for Political Control in Post-Maduro Venezuela. Some of these topics will, of course, come up again. And then a month later, if you plan your calendars that far out in advance, as I know some of us do, on April 28th, our Adrian Arch National Security Resilience Initiative will continue its Reporters at Risk series with an event in collaboration with the Adrian Arch Latin America Center, where we'll elevate the perspective of correspondents who have reported in Venezuela despite extraordinary adversity. So mark your calendars for those two events and for many other events as part of our Venezuela Forward series over the next months. Not only events, but also analysis. Again, watch our Venezuela Weekly every Thursday and other reports and publications coming out of the center. Again, thank you so much to our speakers and to all of our audience for watching today.
Thank you.